Hello, and welcome to this mentor session for the latest generation film contest called History from Your Point of View. I'm Angela Starin, Senior Director of Advancement at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation's mission is to share the story of Abraham Lincoln's life, legacy, and leadership with all people. Our latest generation film contest is inspired by Lincoln's important question to an Indianapolis crowd in 1861. Shall the Union and shall the liberties of this country be preserved to the latest generation? This contest invites young adults aged 14 to 22 to create short historical films from 5 to 8 minutes. This year's theme, On This Land, encourages filmmakers to produce works rooted in their local geography, fostering a deeper understanding of the events, figures, and movements that have shaped their communities and beyond. This first year, the contest is open to participants in the Midwest with plans for future expansion. Submissions are due by December 31st, 2024, with cash prizes ranging from $500 to $2,000 awarded in 3 different age brackets. Winning films will premiere at a red carpet event in Chicago, spring 2025. Our mentor sessions are open to everyone and are designed to share the processes historians and filmmakers use to create accurate and compelling work for the public. The contest and these sessions are made possible by a generous grant from the Better Angel Society through the Amy Marjoram Berg Education Fund. Today, we are excited to welcome Rita Coburn and Stacy Robinson. Stacy Robinson is an award-winning filmmaker with over 20 years of experience producing documentaries for networks such as CNBC, OWN, PBS, and more. As a storyteller, she searches for the emotional soul of every story, no matter how big or small the subject might seem. Most recently, she produced a 6-episode series for Disney Plus on a figure skating troupe from Harlem. Robinson wrote and directed an Emmy Award-winning documentaries on Ida B. Wells and the birth of gospel music for WTTW PBS Chicago. She's the winner of Peter Lisagor Awards for Historical and Cultural Journalism. She received a National Emmy nomination for News and Documentary for her work as co-director of We Are Witnesses Chicago in collaboration with Cartemquin Films and the Marshall Project. She's written and produced a documentary for Discovery Networks on the female doctors who provide health care inside Chicago's Cook County Jail. She and her film crew spent over a month with unprecedented access following the doctors and jail detainees. She's written and supervised a 6-hour follow-up series focusing on pregnant women detained in Cook County Jail and the unique psychological and physical challenges they face. With National Geographic, she served as supervising producer for the series Final Report, focusing on watershed moments in history such as TWA Flight 800, Attica Prison Riot, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and the Gulf War. She was director and producer of a historical documentary on the 1935 Florida hurricane, which aired on History. Originally from Claremont, California, she calls the Midwest home now and serves as artistic director for Cartemquin Films. Rita Coburn is a Peabody and Emmy Award-winning producer, director, and writer across radio, television, and film. She began her career producing and writing for various news outlets and has worked with iconic shows such as The Oprah Winfrey Show and Apollo Live. In 2016, she co-directed and co-produced Maya Angelou and Still I Rise, which premiered at Sundance and won a Peabody Award. She also directed Marian Anderson, The Whole World in Her Hands. She bridges the gap between generations and preserves African American history. Through her work, she uniquely addresses topics from a multi-generational lens with a passion for impacting others through the untold stories of prominent figures and key ideals relevant to African American culture. Before we begin, I encourage you to submit your questions using the Q&A box below, and we'll address as many as possible. Now let's welcome Stacy and Rita.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure, and working with you, Angela, as well as Stacy.
What's really exciting for me is that we're beginning to engage a new generation about historical documentaries. And I think the reason that you've heard so much about archival is because as we look behind us, we're all making archival, we're all making history every day. It's just the things that are behind us that we want to show in the present. And your point of view is tremendously important in our being able to do that. Because if we don't know what you're doing and what you're seeing, it truncates history. One of the reasons I got into this was I was always a storyteller, as most of us are, and you tell the stories of your childhood, you tell stories every day. But when I was looking at the television in the 60s, I didn't see myself. And the Black people that I saw did not seem to be the people that were in my home. And I wondered, where are our stories? And so I began to work on our stories. And I wrote a book. And later on, I began doing documentaries, a lot of documentaries that were local. And what they did was they helped me to understand the geography of where I lived, which is what you're going to be doing. And then that broadened. I mostly like to do documentaries on people. The reason I do that is because people in the landscape of my ethnic background were never really given the opportunity to be fully developed in front of the camera or media. They were either ignored, and that may be the case with some of you, or they were prescribed to certain um, different ideas that may not have been their own. So I wanted to tell our stories. And I found that when you found an iconic figure such as Maya Angelou, Marian Anderson, and now I'm doing W.E.B. Du Bois, what you would find is the place where they lived, the history that they experienced, and who they were um, began to give us a good idea of what was happening in America. And because these iconic figures traveled abroad, you got their point of view. So, as we get into television, what I want to say is for all of you, it may be too early to tell exactly where you're going to land. You're a filmmaker because you're making films. But in the landscape of making films, you have directors who have to be there from start to finish. You have editors that join near the end and love to put everything together. You have directors of photography, what we call DPs. And when they walk into the room, they see something that many of us don't see. And as a result of what they see and what they show, the director's vision comes alive. So whether you're going to end up being an editor, a director, a producer, or you're going to be a writer, or in some documentaries, I direct, produce, and write, whatever that's going to be, you're about to find that out as you do films. And when you start by doing these historical documentaries and you start doing almost every aspect of the documentary, that will help you to get a feel for what you like the most. The last thing I want to say about images is the difference between reading a book and listening to radio is that we operate from theater of the mind. We can both read a different book and we put pictures in our head of what is actually happening. We do the same thing when we hear radio. When we do television, the power of that is that you're concretizing images. So when you hear Michael Jackson do Thriller, you automatically see him moonwalking and you see all that was there because we've concretized that image. When I grew up, if I looked at a screen and there was a white and a black person on the screen and it was going to be about a medical issue, the assumption was that the white person was the doctor and the black person was the patient. And what you have the power to do is to flip that around And now you've concretized an image or brought another image to light. So a lot of documentary making is you having the power to show different attitudes and mores and change visions and get your own vision out there. So I'm about to show you a trailer of a documentary on Maya Angelou. That documentary I co-directed with Bob Hercules. It came out in 2017. And as we did that documentary, I want you to look at the trailer, which of course is just pieces of that documentary with some added graphics. But you're going to see more than archival. Now, you're going to see a lot of archival, so I want you to look at that. But you're also going to see contributors. Contributors are our main character. We've got our main character, and then we've got different people that scholars and friends that we go to. You'll see the contributors, they're all in the present of that documentary. But with the main character, you'll see a lot of archival in there. And another thing that I think is important for you to be able to see is that when you do a historical documentary, you can also use reenactments. These may be a little bit more complex or not. It depends on how far you're going back. If you have an old house, the clothing, the time period, sometimes depending on how old your subject is, you have to go back and do some reenactments or graphics in order to get the information there. So there's going to be a reenactment in this trailer, probably 2 or 3 that you'll see. And then there will also be the contributors, and you'll also see the actual archival. And that would be both footage and stills. So I'm going to bring this up.
Everybody in the world uses words. The writer has to take these most known things and put them together in such a way that a reader says, I never thought of it that way before. My mother's boyfriend raped me. I was 7. So I stopped speaking for 5 years. In those 5 years, I read every book in the Black school library. When I decided to speak, I had a lot to say.
Maya was a dancer. She sang, she was an actress.
I mean, she was a beautiful Giacometti sculpture.
Of course, she was a writer.
When I reached for the pen to write, I have to scrape it across those scars.
Maya was responsible for teaching me why I should know more about my roots. But I remember her being very angry. Very angry. My mother taught me a love of justice, a love of doing what's right.
I know why the cage bird sings. It was a very important literary feat.
Cage Bird was really almost another Bible for me.
It was the opening for me to wanting to be a writer.
It was the first time I read something that resonated. It touched a very young girlish part of me. It reflected my own mother's life. When I read it, I couldn't believe that she was free enough to talk about them. I read those words and thought, somebody knows who I am.
She was big, and she had the voice of God.
Out of the heads of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear in the time, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave, and so I rise. I rise.
So you have this space in which you have various archival that you're putting together. And as you see a person like Maya Angelou, you have the archival from various places where she spoke. Some of them are stills that came from friends of hers, of her, and then there's other movies of her dancing. And so you pull all of these things together in order to help tell her story. But what it really does is it tells an American story in a way that we could not necessarily get there if we did not have um, that point of view that she has. And you have that same power when it's your point of view. So, one of the things that we like to do when we're dealing with documentaries is we really do have to deal with archival. We really have to deal with a lot of the work that people have done in order to get the space to bleed this story out. Now, the story gets big before it gets smaller and comes to time. So you want to use all the archival you can find. And I know that you've been talking to various people about where to find that archival from. And I know people have said the Library of Congress. You have all of those things at your fingertips. But one of the things I want to say to you is in finding the archival is do something that came from a simple space a long time ago, what it seems, and maybe because you're in school, it's not, some of you, it's not that long of a time ago. I think it's important to go see a librarian. You might be talking about a snowstorm. So I went to LOC and I pulled up pictures that you could use that would show you what was happening in that particular year. That's how you use LOC. Alamy is another good archival house. But at the same time, a lot of these things that you see, the government is your best bet because you can use a lot of their work for free. They have gotten pretty savvy lately and they've put a lot of this work on Flickr. So if you wanted to talk about school back in the day, you could find a lot of things here. Most of what I'm showing you is free, but you also may not want to go that far back. You don't have to go that far back in your stories. If you're from 14 to 22 and you're entering this contest, your going back could actually be 10 years ago and it would still be archival. But when you research things that come from the government, most of the time you can get free media. So that's going to be your friend. A librarian is going to be your friend, as well as you will find the cell phone footage that you have that friends may have. Cell phones have been around for a long time now, so some of that footage can be used. I'm thinking of the documentary that was done on Amy Winehouse, and most of it was cell phone footage. And so that's not uncommon to use as well. And you also have the reenactments, don't forget that, and what you can tape on your own. So I think that I'm talking a little bit. Stacy's going to talk, and then we're going to take questions. So with that, I'll just tell you, I had another trailer to show, and if we have time at the end, I'll show that. But I'll leave it there and toss it to Stacy.
Thank you, Rita. That was really exciting to It's always a lot of fun to see how somebody else organizes their work and the steps that they go through. And it's validating to see sometimes when someone approaches something the same way you do. And it's also nice to get some new tips. And I did get some good tips there. So thank you.
Great.
I'm really happy to be here. Like Rita, I am a documentary producer and a writer. I do documentaries on a lot of subjects, but I really like history. Probably is one of my favorite things to make films about. I would not say that was always the case. I didn't know that I was going to really like history until I started dipping into it. So for those of you who this may be your first time trying to do something historical, I'll warn you that it's a little bit addictive. Once you start, you'll start thinking about all the things around you and where and what was the background of them, because it really can be intriguing. And everything, just about everything has a history. So I will say it's really nice that you all are doing short films, because you can do just a small nugget of history or something that may be more difficult to like really investigate. If you were doing a 1 hour film, there may not be so much, but something historical could be something as simple as an ice cream store on the corner that's been there for 50 years, and you go by it and you think, wow, look how old this ice cream shop is. I wonder what its start was. There's probably a really unique history to that, maybe. I'm thinking of an ice cream store in Chicago that's been here for years and years. It's family owned. It's been there for 3 generations. And over the years, hundreds of couples have gone there on their first date, and then they later got married. And it's kind of a famous story behind it, but you don't necessarily think of that as like a bit of history. So history can be really fun, and it can also be really approachable. So one of the things today, we're talking about history from your point of view. I think Rita brought up some really, really great aspects of what makes something, how you can tell history from your own point of view, and the power you have to tell stories that haven't been told before. I think that's a really unique thing that you can insert into your film. There's also, in addition to that, your point of view can live in other ways of how you tell the story too. It could be part of your approach. You may be someone who loves music. So really kind of leaning into the music as a way to share your story. You may have artistic skills, so animating, using cartoons for some of it. There's a lot of things to really inject your own point of view. And why do that? I mean, I think that when as a filmmaker in my own mind, the more I can use my point of view without obviously changing history, because that's not your point of view. That's fiction. But the more I can use my point of view, will often make the story stronger, because I'm talking about what's exciting to me, that translates, and a lot of people have kind of the same interest. So one of the things about, so those are 2 things I have to say about story. And I think there's another thing of like really trying to find your point of view. I mean, it sounds like it's easier said than done. You might not know what your point of view is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So one of the things I kind of recommend in terms of a point of view, or things to remember to make a point of view a little bit different. History, you might think that history starts in 1986, this happened, and you have to go chronological, like in the order of the events happened to tell a story. And that's not necessarily true. Where do you want to start? Where do you want to start? Maybe it's an event. I would recommend that a story doesn't have to start with Once Upon a Time. And I'm going to share my screen for a minute just so I can kind of get started on that sort of idea. That where do you want to start? It doesn't have to begin with Once Upon a Time. So I'm going to share a clip that sort of expresses that idea. Bear with me, sorry. I probably should try to do that beforehand, but that sort of expresses the idea of an event. It's a historical, this was a documentary that I wrote and produced, and it's about the birth of gospel and kind of how it came to the city of Chicago, where we're from. How gospel really, many people say, was born in Chicago, that it had come up from the South as one form of music, but when it reached Chicago and the musicians here, that's really when it transferred into what we know today as like modern gospel music. And it goes back and sort of the documentary really traces it from its roots in the South through the Great Migration to Chicago, and how it traveled with musicians to Chicago, and by mixing it with blues and jazz that was already here in Chicago came this new kind of reinvigorated music that today we really think of as gospel. And so this is the very beginning of the story. And I'll share it with you and talk about starting a story in present day, which is the approach we decided to take with this.
Coming up, with a broken promise ringing in their ears, thousands of Black musicians fled the South.
It is still a Jim Crow reality. You couldn't even walk on the same side of the street as a white person.
They joined the greatest migration in U.S. history.
Thomas Dorsey, blues musician.
Mahalia Jackson, Sally Martin. They came looking for jobs, looking for respect.
For them, Chicago was a city of renewed faith and bold aspirations.
They made the music. You had honky-tonk music, your church music. You had blues when you were feeling bad.
With a sanctified mix of blues and jazz, they formed an explosive new genre called gospel.
Chicago, the Mecca, the hub of gospel activity.
The birth of gospel, next on Chicago Stories. The sun was out in Bronzeville despite the cold. Most Southside residents were going about their business on January 6, 2006, when Pilgrim Baptist Church caught fire.
I was on my way to the church, and the custodian called. He says, the church is on fire. I said, stop playing with me. I remember the devastation and the horror.
It was a famed architectural landmark, but it meant much more to Chicago's Black community.
Generations and generations of people. The whole community came out in tears.
This is a great loss. This is a terrible loss. Great loss to this community, a great loss to the city, and a great loss to the people who have been through those doors.
Let everybody in the house say amen. Let the church say amen. Let the church say amen.
Pilgrim Church was synonymous with gospel music, part of a musical legacy that dated back to the Great Migration, when African Americans fled the South. This is where Thomas Andrew Dorsey, known as the father of gospel music, led the choir for 50 years.
We would not have the kind of Black music that we have, not even just Black gospel music, just Black music, period.
Aretha Franklin, James Cleveland, Albertina Walker, the Caravans, Shirley Caesar, anybody that's on the gospel circuit stopped at Pilgrim because they all appreciated the music of Thomas Dorsey.
As Pilgrim burned, the congregation knew they would endure. The church might have gone up in flames, but the faith of Black people had never been bound by traditional walls. Instead, it had been held strong through music.
This destruction of Pilgrim Baptist Church put a ripple here, but it still stands as a memory. Gospel music relates hope. 24/7. It's hope.
So I hope through that can give you an idea of a narrative story that uses a specific time and place to. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get off screen share. That uses a specific time and place that's in the present to dip back and go into the past. So there's a lot of ways that you can go about trying to tell a story. And again, I think that that's a good way to kind of insert your POV. And I think another one is to ask yourself, what do you find that's really interesting about your subject? If there's a small thing in this point in history, I would consider really leaning into that as another way for you to kind of think about an approach. And for me, I know when you have a big story in history, for me, one of the most challenging things to do is, especially if it spans a large period of time, is to really like find out like where to begin and where to end, and it may seem overwhelming. The subject may seem too broad or may seem overwhelming. So I think another suggestion that I would have is that you think about moments that you can find from history, a story, again, like stories tell narratives, everybody relates to them, a story or a moment that happened that really speak towards the larger story at hand. And if you can isolate those moments and tell that really effectively, a lot of times you can find a way to bridge the gap between a historical subject. And are there characters or people who can help shape your film to do that? I know that Rita talked about participants, people that you would go to that you bring into a film that also tell a story. So if you're doing something historical and there's someone who lived through that time, is a great way to approach it. Maybe someone who's talking about another family member. So it takes a little bit of the pressure off of you where you're trying to start and do everything. You could do something on history where all you do is interview 3 people talking about events that they experienced, and that could be a really effective way to approach a film. And sometimes get to help you with the point of where you don't have to cover it with so much archive and do so much shooting. I would like to share with you one more clip, I think, that in my mind is an example of a moment in history that tells more about the experience. This again is from the Birth of Gospel, and this one is about the migration from the Great Migration, and it's just this one moment in history, but I think it really effectively explains like how people got here and it'll go on to explain how musicians in particular got here. But this is one approach where I think it's where you really can define like storytelling. So you're not just giving a history lesson, but you're really trying to breathe life into history. So people watch it, can be intrigued, and they're sort of living this moment in history. And I think that's how you really that's how you really can make a great film. Even though it's about the past, it won't feel like it's old or kind of staid or dull. You can make it, hopefully, it's what I try to do, is make it something that's really living. So I'm gonna make this full screen. I'm gonna share my screen one more time, check scat, just to make sure I'm missing anything on this conversation that we're having. And I will share my screen again.
By 1916, any hope for equality had faded.
You couldn't even walk on the same side of the street as a white person. And you were going to be living the same life of your ancestors, a life of deprivation, unless you left. It was untenable.
In Chicago, where there was an established African American community, the Chicago Defender and its editor, Robert Abbott, urged Blacks to flee north.
The Chicago Defender was one of the largest African American newspapers in the United States. Abbott was a migrant himself who had achieved enormous amounts of wealth and success.
Abbott employed a network of train porters who earned additional money distributing papers throughout the South.
This message is being carried by porters who are sort of polished and refined and in their uniforms. And it really was seminal in promoting this idea of Chicago as the promised land.
My grandmother always would tell me that those Pullman porters who would come through Mississippi would toss the newspapers overboard, and then they would gather them and then distribute them among each other. The humorous part of the Chicago Defender would always be that it never, ever went into the garbage can. If it got really tattered, they ended up using it as wallpaper.
Blacks mustered the courage to leave, and tens of thousands in Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana boarded northbound trains.
It got to the point where so many African American males were leaving that employers would stand at a train station and not let any Blacks get on the train. Train would move on, and about a half mile up the road, all the migrants would jump out of the woods and jump on the train. That was how badly they wanted to leave the South.
So I think that there's some things in that clip. I hope that gives you an idea about how that helps you understand what I was trying to say earlier about trying to find a moment in history that really helps tell your story, and finding participants who can help you tell the story. The woman who tells the story about her grandmother and the story of the Chicago Defender and the newspaper really, to me, helps bring that idea of that story to life. She's telling you this small little story about her grandmother, but it's really putting you in that time and place of that historical event that happened, which was the Great Migration, where hundreds of thousands of Blacks left the South in droves and came throughout the United States, but mostly up here through Chicago, and the musicians did that as well. The story about the train and Blacks who jumped the train, that's told by the next participant. He kind of takes the stories and carries it through. And then the song that I've added at the end, which is also the music of that time, that's sort of about this traveling, and that was intercut and edited with the photographs of that time to also help tell that story. The elements that were used in it, to Rita's point, she showed you the National Archives, the Library of Congress, where you can get a lot of those assets or bits of archive. All of those were free, pretty much, in that whole sequence that we saw. There were the newspaper articles that were used from the time; those came from the National Archives. The film that we saw of the Pullman porters, that's old film footage that was also in the public domain. It's kind of interspersed with these photographs the recreations which Rita also suggested. Now, those are really high level recreations, but recreations they can be very small. They can show little bits of images, just little small items to help carry the story forward. And then finally, the music at the very end, the song that we hear about the traveling shoes, that's a bit of archive that's also been brought in from the National Archive. So many ways that you can, really things that you can use to help tell your story, which gets me to sort of the next little thing that I wanted to sort of bring up, and I think that may be enough to explain it, is that some of the things that you can use, creative strategies that you can use to create the visuals for your story, what to show when it seems like you don't have anything. So stills, cartoons, drawings, newspaper articles, those are all effective archive that help you tell the story, and you don't have to stay with them. You can create this sort of montage of events, like I did in the clip that I just showed, to help piece them together and really make, a really effective way to tell your story. Another thing that you can also use is movie clips. And I want to talk about this a little bit, though. Movie clips have certain rules of thumbs, but depending on where your story's from, if the clip that you find is to show a piece of history or to explain something in history, there's something that is called, it's not public domain, but there's a fair use argument that it's fair for you to use. It's not fair for you to just take music and clips and just use them as part of your story just to fill time or just because you like them. But if you find something that really shows what you're trying to say or that outlines that history, then for documentarians, if it's a documentary, then there's a fair use argument for it. You have to be careful and you can't use too much of it, but a very short clip is something that we often, documentarians often think of as fair use. And that's another way to define that. Recreations, which we talked about, is also a good way a creative strategy to use if you don't have archive of exactly like an event that you're trying to show. And archive writing, which is something that I just wanted to bring up a brief example of a way that you can use archive writing in a clip to think about if something was written, you could show someone writing and then use the written example of what they wrote to help tell the story, especially if you don't have someone to tell a certain part of the story, but maybe there's been a book written or something else. You can use a little text excerpt from the book to explain that. And I'm not sure it looks like I have a few minutes left. So I think I will share this small example of writing that's a bit of how archive writing was really used as a way to show a part of a story that I couldn't share in another way. This was a documentary about Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells, who's born, she was born in the very last years of slavery. There's not much footage. There's not really very many photographs of her life. There's very few portraits of her, but it was difficult to show that time of her life. And but she had written this book, and it was an autobiography, and that's what most of the documentary is based on. So using her writings was really important as a feature to use in it. And I'm just going to show you kind of an effective way that we were able to use that. So I'm going to share my screen one last time, and this is the last clip I'm going to show, but I'll just share it just to just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about.
The Tennessee Supreme Court essentially attacked her personally to say that she was just being disruptive, that she wasn't a lady that she pretended to be.
I have firmly believed all along that the law was on our side and would, when we appealed to it, give us justice. I feel shorn belief and utterly discouraged, and just now, if it were possible, would gather my race in my arms and fly away with them.
When we think about the modern civil rights movement in Rosa Parks, she had the NAACP behind her. In 1884, it's just Ida B. Wells and her attorney.
Ida B. Wells was starting to make a name for herself. She took a teaching job in Memphis and joined a lyceum founded by Black teachers.
It was a community of sort of thinkers and artists, and she actually took elocution classes, which is speaking classes. And in her diary, she writes about how she was kind of like trying to scrape up the money to pay for her next lesson. And so you wonder, like, what in the world was she preparing herself for? But she was honing her skills.
Each program ended with a reading from the Evening Star, a gossip-laden newspaper which Ida called a spicy journal. She was shocked when asked to start writing for it. As Ida B. Wells first put pen to paper, she found writing to be nothing short of a revelation.
She felt like she could sort of explore more of who she was and express who she was through writing, more than she ever could in teaching.
I wrote in a plain, common sense way on the things which concerned our people. Knowing that their education was limited, I never used a word of 2 syllables where one would serve the purpose. I signed these articles Iola.
When Ida B. Wells first starts writing, she was writing about the things that one would expect a woman who's writing for a church publication to write for. But that started to change pretty early on.
So I just shared that because that, as I mentioned, that's really in that story in particular, the writings were really important, and most of the documentary is really based on the autobiography of the book that was written. So that can be another way to sort of approach telling history from a certain POV and trying to inject really dial into Ida B. Wells' own narration to tell the story of her life. So I hope that gives you some ideas of ways to approach history from your own point of view. And it does look like we have some questions. So I would love to throw it back to Angela or Rita to talk a little bit more about their approach and maybe take some of those questions.
Great. We do have some good questions. Rita, you mentioned that trailer though? Did you want to show that real quick first?
I can show it. What I also like you to, let me share the screen for a moment. Something that I was working on in preparing this does talk about some of the great ideas that Stacy was saying. They talk about fair use, and I'll throw this link in the chat. There's 4 factors of fair use. If the purpose and the character is for a nonprofit educational purpose, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount, you can't use a whole lot of it, and the effect of the use, the value of it. So I was doing a piece recently about the people in San Juan Hill in New York, and we were able to get the use of trailers for West Side Story because their homes were taken away from them to build Lincoln Center. So we were able to use that kind of footage with fair use. So fair use is an important aspect of things. I would also say, because let's say you're in Chicago or you're in another part of the state and you want to go to the History Museum, because you're doing this for educational purposes, you can ask them. This beautiful shot here of kids playing, one doing handstands on the sidewalk, if you're doing something in that time period, that's from 1965. But these are the kinds of things that you can find. Kids in the Sand, 1987. Particularly if you're doing this for educational work, you can contact places such as the history museums. And for students, we talked about Library of Congress, your librarian, the National Archives, social media data, cell phone photos and videos, and the reenactments. And I like the fact that sometimes, particularly with a short, you might not want to be chronological. You might want to find the moment of something. Think about the idea that there's a beginning, middle, and end to every story. And one of the things Stacy was saying, when I love that beautiful piece where you've taken a layer off the onion that people don't know, the fact that there were people that tried to get on the train and people tried to stop them, and then they moved to another area and hopped on. That's not something everybody knows. That creates a moment. And that's what you want to do, is create a moment. And you're also doing Logic 101, premise, conclusion. The part of that writing of that story is saying, these people had a problem. They wanted to get on the train. These people tried to stop them. This is what they did. Now that you brought closure and a nice moment, a nice nugget, then you go on to another story. So when you get to your editing process, that's what's going to happen. You're going to premise, conclusion. Sometimes the premise is going to be in the front. It's going to come back in the middle. It's not going to get tied up to later. But most often, you are doing that kind of beginning, middle, and end over and over again, because when you get to the end, you pay the viewer and they go, oh, now they're waiting for the next thing to happen. And that unfolding of history becomes very important. I will show another clip. This is, let me see, what did I do here? I hope that I am sharing. I don't think I am. Okay. Some of what I told you about, I was under the impression I was sharing it with you, and I'm not sure that I was. So this, you can see my screen now. I don't know if you saw this earlier. Angela, was this seen earlier?
Yes, we did see that.
Okay, so you did see that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is go to another clip. Let's see. And I think you saw this. So this is Marian Anderson. And this is actually the beginning of the documentary, and I'm going to stop it versus doing the trailer, because I just want you to see sometimes how these beginnings go. I don't want you to see all that.
Does this hand, well, let's assume you have talent. This hand also come from your beauty? No. Well, I can't let that stand. I will say that there is talent here and beauty and all of the things that go to get the wonderful hand that you spoke about.
She was the first African American to make her debut at the Metropolitan Opera. She was almost 60 years old. She was pursued by nobility and aristocracy. She enjoyed the life of a diva. She was performing in Europe. You come back home. A light was shown on racism unlike any other time. Kenya draws no color line. She uttered not a word in response, and she stood flat-footed, and she sang. She was the chosen one. She was a powerful being, a powerful spirit that changed the world through her singing voice.
Now the transition from the open into a reenactment.
After one day delivering the basket of laundry for my mother, and I heard a piano being played and somebody singing. I went up the steps and peeped in the window. There, sitting on a piano stool, I saw a woman who looked no different to me, and she was playing very well. She was not dressed up. She was unconscious that anyone was looking at her. In that moment, I realized if she could, I could.
One of the things I want you to see in this is that if you look at this little, I want to take this piece here. We had a piece of a window sitting on a chair and had this young girl walk up to it. She didn't climb up and peek in any window because the house that we were at, the windows were up too high for us to safely get her there. So I want you to kind of think out of the box when you do a reenactment or something, that you are looking at what is visual, but it does not have to be exact. So you're trying to create something. And so that's where your creativity comes in. Now, this was somewhat elaborate. And as Stacy was saying, when you do reenactments, sometimes they can get to be pretty elaborate. But I will tell you that in this particular case, we found a man who had an old house in Oak Park, and he was just a quirky gentleman who was quite wonderful, and he kept everything from 1920. Now, you probably have an aunt or somebody in your family that's the keeper of these old things, and that's what I mean by being a photographer and thinking that way. Because if you will take a look, I'm going to just show you something that I think shows me when I've met a photographer. A photographer walks in the room and they just see something that the rest of us don't often see, but they teach you how to look the way they look. So when this piece right here from Maya Angelou, I didn't notice that she had an M in pearls hanging on a lamp. And the beauty of that is this is how you get an image in and you take up some time and you have the beauty of it. So I'm hoping this will start right where I want it to.
Everybody in the world uses words.
That was very small, but those are the kinds of visual moments that you're looking for. And you want to give a photographer the license to do that for you. And that's when people find out who they are in this business. It takes some time. It's just like you grow up, you don't just learn to read, you learn the phonetics, and then you learn the words, and then you learn the comprehension. The beauty about filmmaking is you're consistently learning how to tell a story. And like Stacy was saying, you just stay open to how best to do this. And sometimes you will be the photographer or a photographer will appear and they'll see something and they'll go, let me just shoot that for a little while. If you look in that reenactment, we start up in the clouds and we take the color out of it so that it becomes washed in the sepia tone of that day. So you're able to be creative in this. So even though history has facts, remember that all those facts, who came up with them? There were years where we believed that Columbus discovered America. Who came up with the facts? So when you talk to people, you have to respect their story. And in the interview process, I have seen interviews where people have given you so much information and you get a nugget, but you get it because you used the right question. You stayed in the moment and you really listened to the person. There's a documentary on the wife of Nelson Mandela, on Winnie Mandela, done by a director, a woman from France. When she did her interviews, she was so attentive to one of the guards of Winnie Mandela that he got so comfortable with her. He told her, he said, you know what, we knew that she wasn't doing anything, but we set spies out in houses around her house to just catch her on everything and to make her uncomfortable. I don't think that man would really wanted to say that. I think that the interviewer was so good and looked him so in the eye, made him feel so comfortable, and was genuinely interested in the story that he said what he said. And so I think that that's another part of it. There are starters, maintainers, and finishers in the television process. For instance, a director has to be all of those. You have to start it, maintain it, and finish it. An editor comes in after you shot everything. They're a finisher. A photographer is in the beginning. They're a starter, but they're not there for the end. So as you grow in this, you're going to find out who you are. You're going to find out what makes you comfortable. And that's the place where you land. A lot of times directors will work with the same people all the time. When I'm in Chicago, I love to work with Keith Walker as a photographer. I just like the way he sees. He shot that Maya Angelou piece. When I'm not in Chicago, I work with a gentleman, Henry Adebanejo. He did I Am Not Your Negro. And I like the way he shoots, which he shot that reenactment and took that window out and put it in a chair. So these are things that you're going to come to as you continue to grow in this field and just get comfortable at being creative. So I know we have questions, but wanted to stick all that in.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for your presentations. It's been really wonderful. So first, Ella says, what are some of the biggest challenges when producing a documentary and how did you overcome them? Stacy, you want to start with that one?
I'm happy to start. Yeah. I think I hinted towards this a little bit when I was talking about my presentation. I hope it helps, but I think one of the biggest challenges is when you have a story, especially a historical story, is oftentimes the length and the breadth of it. The scope is overwhelming, right? You have so much you want to see, especially in a short film. So I really do try to do talking about what kind of what Rita mentioned are little nuggets that are stories that I know I can tell effectively, or that are small and I find them to be interesting or essential, and I'll start with those. I do think that it's important to sometimes have like a timeline and to get everything in involved, but that sometimes that you can spend a lot of time trying to get all that information together and you still don't know where to start. So I would oftentimes hone into something small that you like, that, and you may decide that that's going to go at the very top, and then you're going to dip back in and tell like the rest of the history. But that moment, those moments are really what make a story. So I hope that helps, but that's one of the ways I overcome it. It's just, and another thing I do is I just make myself start. I put it down on paper, or I start editing, or I start, with a tiny little scene, and that just gets the juices flowing.
I think that you have to determine, even if it's a short, what story you want to tell. And there's that old adage of which comes first, the chicken or the egg, and nobody really knows. So you don't have to know. You do have to write and put it down, but you may see a piece of archival or a painting or something that gives you, or music, and that that's your start. So if you get started, the faith of this is that that part will come to you. And that's how I overcome the challenges of a documentary. I like to do chronological documentaries because when I'm dealing with a person's life, I usually have an hour and a half to 2 hours. I always say I start from a point of failure, because if I have 90 minutes and somebody lived 95 years, I can't get it all in. So I'm not necessarily trying to get it all in, but if that person's life was complicated, I want you to follow me through that, if that's my goal, to tell a complicated life story respectful of that particular person. But you will see that there are people like Nelson Mandela, who has had one of the stories that was done about him. One of the films was about his love of soccer and how that transported him through some time and some challenges. I think that as you hone in on what the story is you want to tell, you begin to journal, brainstorm, keep it on the computer, talk it into your phone, think about what feels right about that story, or what feels so bad that you can't stop thinking about it, and what this burning desire is to tell. It's kind of like the reverse of the gossip in us. We want to tell you something that you don't know. And the great things about documentaries is that they're rooted in the truth. Now, whose truth is it? But that's where they're rooted. They're not fictional. So you have some parameters. And I will agree, if you have 5 to 8 minutes, you probably want to tell something that really touches a person, and it's completely doable. If you take a look at most of the commercials on TV, they've got 30 seconds and they can tell you a story in 30 seconds. And start looking at that. Look at that when there's just been, I think Andra Day did a commercial a while back, and I just remember seeing so much in 30 seconds. So start looking at television and short pieces differently, so that you can say, what did this director, writer, producer, cameraman, what did they tell me in this period of time? And then as you see that, that will help you to form where you want to start and what you want to tell.
Okay. So Isabel asks a few questions, and the first one maybe you both just answered, but she says, "Hi, thank you for being here. I'm editing a documentary short by myself for the first time, and I'm a little overwhelmed by jumping into the timeline. How do you make sense of all your footage, and how do you make sense of your footage and how you want to structure your scenes? Any advice would be appreciated." Um,
I feel like we did
okay.
kind of answer that, but I will say something that's specific to editing that I think is sort of a beauty about editing is that your timeline can start out really fat, right? If you're really working in editing, you can kind of make a timeline that's got a lot of length in it, and then watch through it and start trimming it out. There is a whittling down that you can do that in editing that's almost a visual sound. So you'll have a really long timeline that's you still try to get your favorite bites and things in it, but really start with what we call a radio cut. Put all the bites, all the sound that you want in there first, trim that down to as far as you can, and then start adding the visuals. I find that that's a really good approach to kind of get an unwieldy story down small enough for you to understand it.
Yeah, I think that some of the things that are on the internet will really kind of help you if you just read them, even if you don't use everything they have. And I believe the documentary, if you Google how to write a documentary, and how to do this, and the editing will be in there. And you don't have to take everything they say, but you can take a lot of it. And just as Stacy says, you have several cuts when you edit. So you have the talking heads or the radio cut where all you're doing is listening for the story. You don't worry about the pictures first. You get the story down. It'll be fat, but you get the story down. Then you have an assembly, which is a shorter part of that. And you've put people in the correct places. You continue to trim. You get yourself to a rough cut where you have pictures and stills in, and some of them you might just have black cards that say, I need this here, I need that there. Even if it's short, you can do this exercise. Then you do another rough cut where you tighten it again, and you're tightening. One of the things you should be able to do is to play your short or your film and not look at it, and the story still holds. If you can turn your back to it, if you can play it in your car and you're not watching it, you will hear oftentimes where you may need to cut. And the other litmus test for that is, what is the story about? If something has to fall on the floor, it is what the story is not about. And I will take Marian Anderson. Her nephew was very close to her, and he had this situation where he caught polio in Thailand. And because she knew President Kennedy at the time, she was able to call and get him back. I love that story. It was a heart wrencher, but it really wasn't about her. It was about her nephew. So you had to cut it. So when you get to the point of having to cut as an editor and as a director, it is what is not germane to the story that you are trying to tell. It could be a wonderful little side bite, but if it's not the story that you're trying to tell, and there's a saying about, I would have made a shorter film if I had more time, because to make it shorter takes more time than to leave it long. But I always say it's like when I grew up, I had, my gray has now streamlined my hair, but I had huge hair. And I would call myself combing the story, at taking a wet brush, bringing all the gnarls out, just combing and combing until you get it smooth. And that's what's going to help you edit it down. You can hear it. You may fall in love with a section and you know you have to cut it. Use it for a web piece to promote, but it's not the story. So if that helps you at all, your radio cut, your assembly, your rough cut, your fine cut, you bring it to time, the time that you want, and then you've got all the pictures and things in there, and then we have something that's called picture lock, and you just lock every picture that this is, I've got the rights to it, I'm going to use this. I think you can be a little bit more casual in a short, but not by much. It's just less material you're working with, but you still are telling a story.
Okay, well, thank you both. She's got another great question. Do you ever include, so this is from Isabel, do you ever include yourselves in the narratives of your films? Not sure if that's applicable to biographical pieces, but if you have other films where you have the option to weave yourself into the story if you find it necessary. I kind of heard Stacy's voice as a narrator. Is that right?
That's true, but that actually was, I was a narrator in that because I was still in rough cut, which was what Rita was just talking about. That was, I found that clip. I thought it showed something well, but it really wasn't the final narration. But I do have an answer for this. And I think, especially in a short or something where you're really trying to, tell something in your own voice, I think it's fine to insert your, that you can tell history and include yourself in the narrative. It can be, or your personality. Like, I think it would be very interesting to hear someone explain why they decided to tell a story right there within that short story about history. You can put yourself as a character or, a part of the story. You can tell it from your own frame of reference and tell a story about your family, and narrate it, as you said. So I think it's a great device, and it's a good way to engage the audience if that's an approach you like to take. I'm shy. I don't normally like to be part of the story, but if you have a personality for it, I think it's really fun.
I use myself, as you did, in what we call a scratch track. I need somebody to read it. I need the narrator. But by the time you get the narrator, you're really down to that fine cut. You know what you want them to say. But in the interim, somebody needs to say it. And so you say it. And that's probably how you heard Stacy's voice. I have appeared in my films, but you can't tell it's me, in reenactments because I had no money. And so my hands are brushing the hair of the girl or serving the something and so on. But as far as being on the air, I haven't done that. But I have also seen documentaries where the way that they're shot, the person who's asking the question, the interviewee, and the interviewer, you see them both. And there are times when that person may turn to the camera, kind of Abbott Elementary style, and talk directly to the camera. Don't hamper your creativity on this. Have fun with it. I think that if it works, it works. Now, if you don't think it works in the end, you can change that. But I like the idea of being a part of it.
feels fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both so much. So thanks to everyone. Thank you, Rita and Stacy, for joining us today for our latest generation session on history from your point of view. We invite everyone to join us Saturday, October 26th at 1 p.m. as we host producers from Twin Cities PBS, Daniel Pierce Bergen, Leah Hale, and Kevin Dragseth, as they share insights into storytelling, structure, and editing. To register, please visit our website, lincolnpresidential.org/latestgeneration. And before you leave, we'd appreciate it if you could take a short survey about today's webinar and get your feedback. Thank you once again for being with us. We look forward to seeing you on October 26th. Thank you. Take care.
Good luck. Good luck on
Thanks
your
so
phone.
much.
Thank you.